study session of the Independent School District 535 School Board is called to order at 5:31 p.m. on Tuesday, September 17th, 2024, in room 137 of the Edison building. The board acknowledges this site and all RPS sites are situated on the ancestral land of the Dakota people, and we honor the Dakota nations and the sacred land of all indigenous peoples. Present at this meeting are school board members, Superintendent Kent Packel, a non-voting ex officio member, and Assistant School Board Clerk, Ms. Lori Sam. Ms. Sam, would you please call the roll?
Director Barlow.
Here.
Director Cook.
Here.
Director Garcia.
Here.
Clerk Coughlin.
Here.
Director Martin.
Here.
Chair Nathan.
Here.
Vice Chair Wilson.
Here. At this time, we offer the opportunity to say the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Item 2.1 is approval of the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda?
Move approval. Second.
It has been moved and seconded to approve the agenda. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The agenda has been approved. The agenda and documents for this meeting are available online at rochesterschools.org/assembly. This meeting is being live streamed on youtube.com/ISD535. The recording of this meeting will also be posted following completion of the meeting. Item 3.1 is a focus topic, referendum defeat consequences. Superintendent Packel.
Thank you, Chair Nathan and board members. Tonight is authentically a study session where we're looking to have a conversation and get your individual and collective guidance on something that we have heard from our community consistently since the narrow defeat of the referendum that was on the ballot in 2023, which is the desire to know with as much specificity as possible what will happen if the referendum that is on the ballot in November of 2024 does not pass. And so tonight's discussion is a precursor to a resolution that I plan to present to you at the next regular board meeting for your consideration and potentially action at the following board meeting that would give our community some sense of this board's broad thinking about what would happen if the referendum doesn't pass. The tension, of course, as board members know well, and as I will outline on a brief presentation here in a moment, is that that notice comes ahead of more than 8 months of detailed budget planning that take place every year before you vote in June. And as board members are well aware, every year, new information, changes in enrollment, in state funding, in labor costs, all play into that final budget. And so in a desire to respond to the request from the community for a sense of how this board would stabilize the district's finances if the referendum does not fail, we're also navigating the tension of a fact that the budget process for 25-26 has not yet begun in earnest. And so therein lies the conversation that we will be having this evening. And so assuming that I can make the clicker work, we will be moving into this discussion of the study session. I have learned the hard way that it's always important to at least briefly state the why when you are looking at difficult issues like the ones that we are looking at here. And so on the screen, you can see a picture that is coming to be well known here in Rochester. I probably have dreams or nightmares about it frequently. It is the increase in the general fund, which is our primary source of funding from the state of Minnesota that has occurred over the last couple of decades. That's depicted by the dotted orange line. And you can see there the blue line that is above it is what the funding increase would have been had funding increased at the rate of inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index. And had that happened, we would have more than 18% per student higher funding than we do today. So therein is the primary source of the structural deficit that we are grappling with in Rochester Public Schools. The second is a more local deficit. As you can see there, another picture that's becoming well known in our community of the school districts in the state that serve 10,000 or more kids, and there's 15 of them. Rochester ranks last in voter-approved operating levies, and we are well below that green line that depicts the average. Should the referendum pass, in November of 2024, we would be slightly below that average. But in the meantime, that comparatively lower level of local support is the second source for that structural deficit that we have been working to grapple with. As I mentioned a moment ago, timelines matter a lot here because the work that John Carlson and Andy Krogstad and their team do is painstaking, as the last 4 audits without a single finding indicate, and very well done in Rochester Public Schools. But it is not done at this point in the year, and yet we have had a request from our community to give some guidance before the election on November 5th. So normally in a school year in November of this time of year, we'd be actually looking backward at the finalized audit from the previous school year. In December, you will formally approve the property tax levy within the constraints that the state gives this school district and all school districts. In January of 2025, so then when we're firmly into next year, we will begin to update the financial forecast, and at least since I've been here in Rochester, you have set budget parameters each year that have been tremendously important in our development of the budget, guided by your policy direction. Then in February and March, we engage in those really critical meetings with our building principals about their student enrollments, their educational needs, what they're seeing in their data, and the investments that they want to make in literacy and math and other areas. And then, of course, we have a contractual responsibility by the end of March to notify staff who would be losing their position. As board members know, this year in Rochester was the first year since I've been here where we didn't have a lot of those conversations. We did for more than 150 positions in my first 2 years. It has been great not to have those conversations with folks and instead be talking about our academic agenda. Then in April and May, we take those findings from our discussions with our building leaders and we build those line-by-line budgets that board members dig into as we get into the budget homestretch in May and June of every year. And so the resolution that you might choose to approve at the next 2 regular board meetings would come far in advance of a lot of that analysis. But it's not entirely, by any means, theoretical. We know a lot about the core bottom line of the district's financial position. That does lead me to believe that it is prudent to give our community some formal sense of this board's plans for dealing with this strategy. So I think board members know I usually like pictures and graphs and not words, but in this instance, I think it was helpful to put the narrative down. So I'm gonna read to you for a little bit here, and then we will shift into the conversation piece. As I've made the point a couple of times, this is a response that has come from our community, in particular in the listening sessions, community meetings, and the web survey that we did after the narrow failure of the 2023 referendum to let people know what happens if the referendum doesn't pass. So the budget would normally, as we just saw in the previous slide, go into high gear starting in January with a lot of preliminary work happening starting in the late fall. Over the next months, really important information will come into play that will influence the proposal that we will make to you in the summer, at the end of the school year. And you see there several of the most important variables. Salary and benefit costs based on contract settlements. We continually are in negotiation with some union somewhere, and we have important contracts that will be up in the year ahead. Health insurance contributions are based on the actual cost of our employees' illnesses and wellness over the course of previous years. Enrollment projections are a critical driver of our financial position, and so we are constantly trying to get the best projection we can of how many students we'll be privileged to serve. State and federal funding levels can be highly variable. Recent change in Minnesota to the general fund, indexing it at the rate of inflation, could be a game changer for the lack of predictability for K-12 education if it is preserved in state policy as we expect it to be. And yet there are categorical funds. Another important variable that in Minnesota lays out there is compensatory education revenue, which is generated by kids who live in low-income families, as you know, has historically been determined by percentage of kids with free and reduced price lunch. As we have moved to free universal breakfast and lunch, that measure is losing a lot of its incentive for families to sign up for it. And so the state has to come up with a new methodology to calculate the compensatory revenue. In the meantime, all districts have been held harmless, but John, I believe that goes through 2025. So we are on the cusp of having some new way of calculating what is a very significant revenue source for our district, and we're not sure exactly what that methodology is going to be at this point. Then there's the funding from local levies that is significantly determined by where you set that levy by December, but there also are things that play out as the numbers are crunched. And then, of course, utilities costs, and there are others. The structural deficit that we've been talking about in the referendum since the budget projections that we completed last year after the failure of the 2023 referendum have talked about a structural deficit of just under 20 million. It is, in my view and in John's view, very likely that that is the amount that we would need to cut. And so in moving into the discussion here tonight, I don't want to suggest any backtracking from that analysis. But because should you choose to pass a resolution on the 2025-2026 budget, we would want to take it extremely seriously and be able to stand by what we told our community through that board action. I would recommend that the resolution identify $16.7 million of reductions that we are absolutely certain would need to be made. And the logic of that amount within the larger nearly 20 million structural deficit is that we know Mayo Clinic is not getting out another check for $10 million. And we know that we cannot do what we did last year, which is draw down $6.7 million in reserves. And so a conservative recommendation would be to pass a resolution that says, we know we will cut $16.7 million. I am, as I've said, quite sure that it will be more than that, but I would not want to, should the referendum not pass and we get into the spring, have to come to you and to the community and say a very different level of reduction is required. And so it essentially would be passing a resolution that says, this is the known, and so we're telling you the strategy that we would use for that, understanding that it is likely significantly higher. Now, what would the board resolution, because again, this is uncharted territory, this is not part of our normal budget process, and I certainly hope it does not become that. What would the resolution say? In my current thinking, the resolution would direct us to develop a budget proposal for the board that includes a reduction of $16.7 million. That, of course, would be a board direction, and we would meet it. The board's actual approval of that reduction, however, would not happen until you approve the actual budget for 2025-26. You would be directing us to build that into the budget proposal. Your approval of that would come, as it is every year, when you approve the final budget in June. And as is always the board's right, you could make changes in it through that discussion. But we would develop a budget that was based upon those plans. Just to give a brief graphic to how much of our funding we're talking about here when we talk about that $16.7 million, it's the two darker pieces of that pie chart that would be at play here. The reserves, which this year are covering 2.3% of our budget, and the Mayo Clinic contribution, which is covering 3.4%. That may not seem like very big slices of that pie, but it is a lot of money, and it would require very significant reductions to close that gap. And once again, I anticipate that it would be more than that, but we're certain that it would be that. So as a starting point for the board's discussions and conversant with the analysis that we started to do last year after the referendum narrowly failed and before Mayo Clinic stepped in with its contribution and before the board decided to use one-time use of reserves, there are four broad categories that I would recommend the board include in a resolution directing us to bring you a budget reduction plan in the amount of $16.7 million. School closures would be the first category in that plan. The logic of that is that while there is every reason to believe that Rochester is growing as a community and our enrollment will grow, and that I believe it's prudent not to close elementary school buildings, we do have capacity that could be reorganized in order to be more efficient in the 3 to 5 years that demographically it's going to take to be back at the point where we need those buildings. It's important to say that if you close buildings, you also redraw attendance boundaries, because you can't close a building and keep everything the same. It doesn't work. The purpose of that is to gain efficiencies by putting more kids into fewer buildings. And so we would save $2,304,392. These are very specific numbers that are shared with you so you have a sense of what the division of this strategy might be. The second would be the very difficult step of increasing class size by 3 students. As board members will recall, we've raised class size by 1 student since I've been here. That was headed in the wrong direction. This would be even further in the wrong direction. But candidly, that is where you begin to save the serious money. And it's not possible to begin to get to the level of reduction we would need without going to that core cost of class size. The third category would be the positions that are centrally located, starting here in the Edison building and our central administration, but also positions in our schools that are what I called non-instructional, so not classroom teachers. The class size reduction is essentially a reduction in instructional staff and the number of teachers. The third category is a reduction in positions at the building level that are non-instructional and at the central office level. And our current projection there would be, I'd recommend, $2,381,608. And then finally, we come to the 4 investment areas, which I'll briefly tick through in a moment, that are at the core of the referendum proposal. And those 4 investment areas would, if the referendum is approved, receive 10 years of funding, increased for the rate of inflation, thereby, I believe, guaranteeing the community and our families that they will be supported throughout that 10 years. If the referendum fails, those Ignite student learning investments, unfortunately, are things that in this school district and in many school districts that get into dire financial circumstances need to be cut, because those are the things that are not the basic 1 teacher, X number of kids, bare bones requirements that you need in order to operate schools. They're those things that ignite student learning. And so that reduction would generate $6,378,956. As board members know, the referendum would provide much more support than that. That's because you can't cut all of the investments that would receive referendum support and meet state requirements and, frankly, keep our schools running and functioning. So briefly to highlight what's in those 4 investment areas, the first, as you all know, those positions that support assist students who need more support to thrive. You can see those there. Programs that challenge our advanced students and enrich learning for all students. Services that strengthen student well-being and mental health. Very importantly, just there's been a little confusion on this. The primary funding in that category would go for our school counselor positions, really critical function for our schools. The mental health screening is critical to our strategic plan, but a very minor cost financially. It's actually next year about $30,000. The work of the clinical social workers and others who do the mental health screening is not included in that category, and I'll add that to future referendum updates, because I've gotten some feedback that among some of our internal folks that was a little confusing. And then finally, our career and technical education programs, C-Tech, P-Tech, our classes in the high schools, and then our post-secondary and career planning. So the discussion questions that we are hoping, obviously the chair and the board can take the conversation wherever you'd like to take it. The discussion questions that we are hoping to hear from you on tonight really center on 4 things. First of all, do you want to do this? That's in some ways the most important. Do you want to have us prepare a resolution for your next regular meeting and then action at the following meeting that outlines a direction that you would be giving me for the preparation of the 2025-2026 budget if the referendum does not pass? Second, if you do want to take that step, do you have feedback on the proposed reductions that I've identified in this study session? Are there other areas that you might suggest we should consider? We could take those down in discussion tonight. I know it's probably not, at least on my part, a good idea to respond to them in detail, but you certainly could raise them. Number three, within those four broad categories that I just outlined, should more specific reductions be identified? Those four are intentionally broad, and they are intentionally broad for two reasons. Number one, I don't think anybody wants to or should find out on September 17th that their job might be cut if a referendum doesn't pass. And so we would always keep those things general. But more importantly, as I said at the outset, we have more than 8 months of analytic work on developing the budget that we would need to conduct before we could identify the specific reductions. I believe we could save $16.7 million out of that broad proposal. And so I would not recommend being more specific than that, but board members could choose to go in a different direction. We could choose, for instance, to identify which schools will be closed if the referendum doesn't pass. I would not recommend that because I think there's important analysis that we would need to do if that unfortunate circumstance happens, but we could be more specific. And then finally, what information would you as board members like to receive to inform your consideration of this potential resolution at the next two meetings of the board? And so those are our questions, Madam Chair, and I'll turn it back to you. I want to make sure that, I probably don't need to say it, but especially that, cabinet members are always encouraged to join in these study session discussions, but in particular John, and I know Andy's in the back there. If there are finance issues, please don't hesitate to jump in as well, including correcting me if there's a need to do that.
Dr. Workman.
So fortunately, you didn't express it verbally the way the number one discussion question is worded, but you said, do we want to do this? And the answer is, we never want to do this. I've been through extraordinary budget cuts the entire time I've been on this board, and it is painful, it hurts people, it hurts their livelihood, and most of all, it hurts our kids. So that said, I think that I personally would like to see a resolution directing staff to include a set of identified reductions in the budget if it doesn't pass.
Director Barlow.
Similar to Director Workman, it's not really a matter of want, but it's more born out of necessity. I probably have three questions, Madam Chair, if that's okay to roll them out.
Sure.
I know at this point it's difficult to, while you have done an excellent job in identifying numbers, dollar figures, if you will, it would be nice to potentially see how that relates to number of personnel. And in terms of class size, or yes, increase of class size by 3, is this across all grade levels? Okay, and then finally, in many ways, the board hires the superintendent to manage, understand the system needs, and so I really don't at least see myself, telling you who has been hired to inform us as to where you believe those cuts and or adjustments need to occur. I think it is important that you make us aware and give us opportunity to have the discussion as we begin that process tonight. And additionally, to allow the public to also understand the brevity of the situation, not brought on as a result of mismanagement. You have in the past referenced our audits, which are conducted annually, and we have passed them admirably. Again, John and his staff. So it's a structural deficit, as you mentioned. I was curious, because not everyone may know, I think I have a pretty good understanding as to the funding formula and the ADR or APR, the student daily count. I'm not sure the public fully understands that, and if somewhere along the process, we could bring that back to light so they can understand, well, yeah, the state, maybe they're not giving us he once did or should, and it's based on this criteria here. Okay? Thank you.
Can I just, Madam Chair?
Please.
Thank you, Director Barlow. I think we can bring you the estimate of number of personnel. That's a good idea. As you may recall, when we were doing very macro analysis last year, if we closed the entire deficit, structural deficit, with cutting positions, so no cuts to budgets, programs, all people, it was over 200 people that were cut. But that was at average salary. So if you that literally took the average salary and what would get you to just under 20 million, it was 200 people. But that's different than this proposal, so we can give you some sense of what the personnel might be. We also can give you the class size piece, which of course to Director Workman's point and yours, nobody wants to do. That could be made at different places, so we could outline some broad scenarios for that one. And yeah, we can never declare victory on needing to explain the complexity of per pupil funding in Minnesota, because it is what drives everything, and a kid is not a kid is not a kid identically. There is a complexity to how they're weighted and the revenues. I think probably that's something that we may not be able to get done by the time we bring you this resolution, but I'm sure we could commit to do that as part of our ongoing process.
Thank you.
Sure.
Is it relevant to Director Barlow or you're going?
It's sort of wrong. Let somebody else talk.
Director Cook.
Well, thank you for this information. I do think that this is critical for our community to have, as best we're able to provide it, an understanding of what this board is faced with to address the deficit next year. For me, the prospect of increasing class sizes by 3 would be extraordinarily difficult. And of course, I recognize that no one is doing this because they think it is efficient or pedagogically sound or something that is in the best interest of students. But I do think this board is broadly charged with identifying the priorities that are going to best meet the needs of our students, and create an educational system that's reflective of the priorities of our community. And I think all of us acknowledge that the academic mission is job one. And I just don't see how, and I don't necessarily have a better answer, and I certainly can't think of a single thing that I would be excited about proposing as an alternative. But I don't know how we could continue to offer varsity sports and reduce class sizes by 3. I don't know how we could continue to have robust offerings in performing arts and increase class sizes by 3. And I certainly recognize the value of those things broadly. I would never want to see a school district that wasn't able to offer those things. But I think we have to ask ourselves seriously, where's the line? Would we accept class sizes of 50? I'm sure not. They're already too big. They are. So I just, that one would be very difficult for me. And I would like to explore what some alternatives to that particular item might be.
Thank you. That's exactly the kind of feedback we're looking for tonight.
Director McLaughlin.
Again, I agree with what others are saying. It's not something we want to, but may need to do, depending on the circumstances in November. I do have a couple questions about the slide with the proposed reductions for board resolution. You had mentioned, as you were talking about increasing class size by 3 and reducing the central office, obviously impact people. Does the closing the 3 elementary schools impact people as well, or is it a combination of people and things?
It does, but a more limited number of people. You lose those positions that are only needed once in a school. So a nurse position, a administrative positions, custodial positions. The other positions that are directly tied to student count would shift generally to a new building, although it doesn't play out perfectly neatly. But that's why school closure saves money, but it's not, especially if you're in a community like ours where there is very solid, not wishful thinking, reason to believe that enrollment is headed upward. It is an often short-sighted thing to do because the savings, while we do get to $2.3 million, could be 5 years from now needing to be reopened for a relatively modest reduction. Are there any other positions, Sean, besides ones that I mentioned with school closure that we know don't move to another building?
I think you hit most of them. Custodial, yeah. Maybe an instructional coach, maybe a school counselor, a social worker, because they're given this many for a building.
Yeah, you do gain some efficiencies. And then, of course, the operational costs, utilities, there's definitely savings there for sure, but in terms of people, it's actually relatively limited, given that obviously we serve the other students in the school.
And a follow-up to that, kind of what you had mentioned earlier about closing, but then potentially reopening later. Would those buildings just sit empty during that interim? Is there other, we wouldn't sell them, I guess, is the other thought that I had is like, the real estate, can we sell them, cover the deficit?
From what I know now, my recommendation would probably be to shutter and hold them, except, as the board knows, there is a second tier of facilities issues that you've asked me to bring you recommendations on in the near future. For instance, what happens to the building formerly known as Friedel. And so we could have some strategic decision. We could make some strategic decisions about certain buildings that, for reasons of age or condition, you would take offline. But generally speaking, there is every reason to believe that we will need those buildings in Rochester in the medium term, like the near medium term. So that's why I would not recommend doing that. I think school districts, and they exist in our state, make a terrible mistake when they subsidize buildings with too few kids to support a quality educational program, and they do that on a sustained basis. I understand why they do that, but you then are reallocating resources to keep a building open. That is not the circumstance here in Rochester. There is, every demographic projection says we're going to be headed up, but contrary to what some of the buzz was, the Mayo Clinic investment is going to mean 2% employment growth every year in the clinic, and the city estimates that generates about another 1%. So there's a lot of communities around the country that would kill for 3% a year growth. It's actually a really good pattern for urban growth. It means we, as the school provider, don't have a sudden influx in 1 year, but it means we fill those buildings up in a progressive way over the next decade. So that's one of the things that leads me to hope we don't need to make this recommendation to you.
Another question kind of rolling around my head is that, just so that the community understands that closing them, shuttering them, not using them for a period of time, and then reopening would be much cheaper than selling and building new.
Yeah. Yep, that would be why you
And then I just
take
have
them offline.
one more question. You mentioned a couple times in the presentation the reserves. Is there any possibility of using reserves as part of that same chart? Your projection for next year, I actually was just looking at it today. I don't want to get it wrong off the top of my head. We're not at the 8% requirement that we wouldn't be, but we don't want to be down at the razor thin. And so, the reserves are taking a significant downward trend this year per your decision making. But yes, one of the reasons that the decision making was about the healthcare.
Yeah, decision about the healthcare and 6.7 million. You gave us the authority up to 7, and then we only needed 6.7. Could some marginal use of reserves be used for the 25-26 school year? Yes, but not as much as we did this last year, and it can't be a sustained strategy. That's one reason why I would recommend that if you do choose to approve a resolution, we set it at that $16.7 million, because we know that's a cut. There's no prospect of using reserves to completely avoid that. The other variables that could play out between now and June could result in a different budget proposal to you, but there's just no scenario, and I know John shares this conclusion, in which at least that 16.7 million would not need to be cut.
Then one final question, sorry. You talked about doing a very deep analysis about closing buildings. Can you provide us at some point with a time frame of when that would be completed? So when community, if the referendum doesn't pass, when we would let people know about building closings?
Yes, we can definitely give you a timeline for that.
Dr. Marvin?
Do I understand it correctly, if one of the questions before us tonight is whether, what? It's right here.
No.
Oh. Other, I close. Okay, thank you. If we want the superintendent and the staff to come up with specific recommendations before November for closures, 'cause my concern about that is that I think that the parameters you've set and the sort of the general areas that would need to be cut are very clear. And it's, as others have said, particularly frustrating right now when I don't think the school district has ever done a better job of creating the kind of programs and the kind of opportunities that our kids need. The cuts that have been made already were intelligent, and we have worked through those, and I think we are really on a trajectory now to make this school district extraordinary. So this is just, this is a killer. My concern about making the recommended cuts more specific, like which 3 elementary schools would be closed. My concern is that that's going to shift the conversation to not my school. Why are you picking on my school? Why are you choosing my program? I am hoping, and I'm hearing from the community, even the 80% of people who don't have kids in our schools, is that they value what we're doing. They value what we can provide for students. And they want this to pass for everybody's kids, for all students. And I worry that it's going to get to it's going to ignite anger about why the particular program or the particular school that I'm most invested in. I think we have to keep this conversation about all of our children, which means every single kid in our school district.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Marvin. And my recommendation is not to be more specific, but I wanted to raise that as a possibility. I think, like Director Cook, raising 2 other areas, arts and athletics, is not being more specific within a bucket. It's still raising a bucket. So, for instance, should I recommend and you approve adding arts and athletics, I would not recommend naming the sport. I would recommend saying there would be this level reduction if we added that to the resolution. I think when we get to which school, which sport, even more for me than the people feeling singled out or one against the other, which is real, I agree with you, there needs to be smarter analysis that would be done before I could make those specific recommendations. And candidly, this is not the time of year normally where we would be doing that kind of analysis, but our community is asked for some clarity about the broad strategy before November 5th, and so we're trying to be responsive to that. We would never want to make a bad decision about closing a school or cutting a sport. And so my recommendation would be, should you choose to pass this resolution, it is at that general level.
Director Work.
So I have several questions. One is just a clarification on selling buildings. I believe that money cannot go back into the general fund for operational use. It has to go into, is that debt service or?
Yeah, so there's 2 paths to go down. If we still owe money on a bond that we use to either build it or remodel it, then we should put the money in debt service. If we are free and clear, so to speak. There's no mortgage on the building, then goes in the operating capital fund, reserved for future facility issues like rebuilding, repairing, those kinds of things.
I thought clarification on that would be helpful. And then on your proposed reductions for a board resolution, reductions to the 4 Ignite student learning investment areas, and I'm looking at these 4 areas. That price tag is about 6.4 million. That's just reductions, or it's not eliminations of the program? I mean, what would happen, I'm not recommending this, if a program were completely eliminated, and once again, I'm not going to ask you for a specific program to be eliminated, but at some point, rather than kind of chewing around the edges, it might make more sense to say, this program is gone.
It's a very important point. That should say reductions and eliminations.
Okay.
Because there would have to be some eliminations to get to that level. You couldn't just do less in every one of those areas. That would not be, to Dr. Marvin's point, that would not be a strategic way of cutting the budget, which is what we've tried to do. So there would be some eliminations in that for sure.
And then another point I would like to make on the class sizes is we often hear, oh, we need to reduce class sizes, but every time a class is reduced by 1 student, it costs us $1,888,000, okay, whatever. I'm not, yes. Almost $1.9 million per student. So when we say we're going to reduce it and it saves us this, or by reducing classes, it saves us this money. Conversely, if we want to say we want fewer kids in the classroom, that's going to cost us these dollars more. So at this point, I think it's impossible to entertain the idea that we are going to be reducing class sizes with what we have in front of us.
Certainly tied to this budget cut, there's no prospect of it. I think if the referendum passes, and if you approve some of the ideas that are in the rethinking funding proposal that we gave you an update on before, schools could, and to some extent our schools do this already using certain funds, schools could choose to lower class size at certain targeted grades and grade levels, but they would have to make the budget balance.
Right.
But they would have more flexibility to do that within parameters. And so that's our discussion in December, once we find out what happens in the referendum.
Dr. Garcia?
Maybe I'm just being dense about this, but can you give us a general time frame in which, if we did ask for specifics, when you could have that effective full analysis about what would be appropriate specific cuts? What time frame would we be talking about? Before or after the referendum, I guess, is my question.
Well, absolutely by the time you approve the budget in June, and we've always presented you with drafts of that budget through the winter and spring. I think that certain of those cuts would need to wait until that timeline, like that third category, reduce central office and other non-instructional positions. Those are individual people's jobs. School closure, I think we not only could, but we would need to front load that significantly ahead of that because of the planning, action. The reason that third category probably plays into the normal budget process is because it has to do with enrollment, labor contracts, labor costs, and so as I know you know, in the end it comes down right to the end with which positions actually need to be cut. For school and program closures or major reductions, I think given the seriousness of the situation we would be in, we would seek to advance that notice significantly ahead of the budget proposal. As you know, when we had the last referendum fail and before Mayo Clinic stepped in, you had before you a proposal to close 3 schools in December and January. So we turned that around quite clearly, and you had specific schools that were identified at that time of year. And then, of course, we were pleased to pull back from that when Mayo made that contribution. I don't want to make a commitment that we need a little more time, so we've already had a request from Director McLaughlin for the timeline, so we'll include that with the resolution. I can't imagine us moving slower than we did last year, and November was the date of the referendum failure, and by December, we were telling you that the specific 3 schools that were going to close. So I would imagine working at least on that level of speed, because we know families and staff would need to be planning for the consequences.
I think the thing that I struggle with in what we heard is, even though we knew by plan example what might end up closing or what things we might do, the psychology for most people wasn't, oh, it's probably going to be our elementary school. It wasn't until we identified the elementary school that people felt like they needed their voice to be heard or something to be said. If that same amount of people had rushed the polls and voted with their preference, I think we would be in a very different position right now. And so I do struggle. I appreciate you not wanting to sort of jump ahead of this or put the horse before the cart, and I respect Dr. Marvin's feedback. I see the other side of that, as if we're not telling people with as much specificity as possible, they're all gonna feel blindsided, and like we, year after year, are still not being transparent about the process. And I think that there are things that, even if we choose not to disclose which schools they are, which positions they are up front, I think even adjusting language, like in that sort of multi-point slide that you had, like basically 5 through 8, it's a lot of like, it might be this, but maybe not, because we're not really sure, but definitely this. I think it just we need to do at a minimum, 16.7 million is gonna be cut up to this amount, and this is what it's gonna mean. Because I think when you say likely or maybe or potentially these 3 schools or this type of program, it doesn't really mean anything to people until you identify Pinewood, for example. And I think we got all those panicked phone calls in December and January, and people that wanted us to make a different decision, and we didn't have the opportunity or the option until somebody else stepped in. And so I think, if we're not going to have another hero in Mayo, if this doesn't work, because depending on a knight in shining armor as like a budget plan is like not, that doesn't work. I feel like we do need to balance the very direct and with as much specificity as possible, with recognizing that we don't have all the answers right now. And I think it's okay to say, like, at a minimum, this is the thing that's gonna happen. And this is how we might pull back. And I think to Director Barlow's point, you're the one that's tasked with the management of all of this, and I wanna respect your position in that. So I'm not gonna tell you, like, I need you for me to identify these 3 schools. Or tell us which classes exactly are gonna be increased by 3. But I think maybe merging Director Cook's point of what are our values, and they should be academic in nature. I was a band kid, I played sports. It would have not felt good to have any of those things cut, but I can also recognize I wouldn't have gotten into college if you had cut my English classes or my science classes or my language classes. It feels like another impossible position to be in, and I don't necessarily think it has to be, but I suppose the point, or the more direct place where I'm trying to go is, even if you don't tell the board, I imagine that whatever you're gonna decide when you're talking to the cabinet, that if there are 3 easily identifiable elementary schools that you would put on the chopping block, that there's something about those schools that we need to address even if the referendum passes. Like, we are still gonna need to shore up a bunch of supports or resources for them. And wouldn't it behoove us to just know that about our school district right now? If there are places where we feel like we could slim down here, because this feels like a luxury for whatever reason, but it ends up not being the case, I think we still wanna identify those schools as like, why did we think that they were the ones that were the thing to give up? And if we do have to give them up, or we do have to increase class sizes, I think that we need to be as honest as early as possible about who exactly we're talking about. Because I think we got a lot of feedback too about multiply disadvantaged students and areas of Rochester that felt like they were being targeted. And we wouldn't want them to be those same people on the chopping block again for this these referendum cuts, or these cuts if the referendum does not pass. So I feel that the dialect of, yes, I recognize like scare tactics don't feel good psychologically, and everybody felt blindsided when we did name the schools. And so maybe if there's somewhere in the middle that we can do this and still recognize, like, if we know that this stuff isn't what we need it to be, we need to take a long and hard look about why that is and what we need to do moving forward, regardless of the referendum outcome.
I really appreciate those comments, Dr. Garcia, and they actually helped me realize there was a better way to describe, there was a missing piece from the way I described the time we need. I think in my earlier comments tonight, I made it sound like mostly what we need is time for staff analysis, internal analysis, and that is important. But what I think is the bigger need for time is exactly the process of stakeholder input that you just described, which, yes, was painful and rambunctious, but ultimately very valuable. And I know people were continually shocked during the discussion last year of the attendance option redesign that we listened and we changed the proposals because people had good questions and ideas.
I was shocked and I was there.
And we did, we really did. We put those schools out there because we frankly had to give people either a flag to rally around or a target to shoot at, and it was more the latter than the former. And then we got, very smart questions, whether it was the number of kids that could fit in the Riverside building, or the changes to an attendance area, or the need to keep Churchill and Hoover together, even though making Hoover an early childhood center is a slam dunk for other reasons. So that process really was invaluable, and it took some time, and it generated a better proposal. And that was not just internal staff analysis. That is important, but I really hear what you're saying. I think that timeline, once a proposal is announced, and school closures is what we're focusing on in this discussion because, of course, it is so visible, but all of these cuts would have constituencies. As board members remember, when we were cutting $14 million 2 years ago, it was right up to the last minute that we were having robust discussions as a board about what you would and wouldn't support, and you were hearing from stakeholders about literally parts of a position in certain places. And so all of it generates feedback. And so part of that timeline is the space for that feedback. And that's why to include specifics in a proposal that you would, a resolution that you would vote on before the election could not account for that kind of robust public response that I know we will get if we are closing schools or cutting programs. So that would be one of the tensions. But I really appreciate the point, and I hear you see the big tension that is inherent in this strategy.
I've been through this a few times, both as a parent and as a board member, and I agree with Director Workman. Nobody wants to do this, and none of these alternatives are good. But I'm usually a very positive person, but I'm going to say I don't want anybody watching tonight or anybody around this table to have this conversation give them any hope. Hope that suddenly we're going to find a different $16.7 million somewhere else in our budget. That means we won't have to close elementary schools, we won't have to increase class sizes, we won't have to cut those positions, and we won't have to cut in the Ignite student learning areas. Because if you spend as much time with this budget as I have and with the charts of the FTEs, I've looked, it's 9 pages of FTE numbers express 1 or 2 FTEs at a time. Some of those positions we have to operate a district. There isn't another $16.7 million somewhere else. So what you're seeing on the page tonight, the the specifics that have been laid out in the Ignite student learning areas, you could take a red pen and say, those are gonna be gone. So I struggle with talking about a lot of alternatives, because other than what Director Cook brought up in the areas of academics and athletics, which does add up to a few million, but not 5 million. I struggle with talking about alternatives that might give people who are considering how to vote on the referendum some hope, that we're going to find a way to solve this problem. We wouldn't have gone to the community about a referendum if we felt we could solve this problem by cutting. We don't want to make any of these $19.4 million of cuts. I have seen things be cut and go away and never come back. We say this all the time. In the 24 years I've lived in Rochester, I've seen opportunities that were precious to students and families leave. And the opportunities that the superintendent and the team have laid out beyond the class sizes and the closing schools are advancements that we've been able to bring to our students over the past few years that have really impacted student success. The fact that reading specialists and curriculum is one of the first bullets in the face of all of our literacy work is tragic. But I do want to ask some questions. So if we were to close schools and move students into other buildings, what's the consequences for the learning environment in those other buildings? One of the reasons we built schools was, at the time, a number of our buildings were at or over 100% capacity. And we did build schools to adjust for future enrollment. So are we going to just be putting kids into another crowded situation that we built the schools to avoid? Or what kind of data could you give us before we made that decision that would help us understand that?
We would obviously strive for balance, and we have got schools that are very full just because of the size of the building and the number of kids that are immediately surrounding those schools, and obviously those are off the table. You can't fit a whole other school into Falwell, for instance, just because of the number of kids that live in that community who choose that school. There are other schools where we would seek to do it as efficiently, as cold and calculating as that sounds, as we could. That said, there's a growing body of research on school closures that highlights, starting in Chicago, where that has unfortunately been a phenomenon for them in the last 20 years, highlights the negative impacts, not just on the kids who have to move schools, which actually we've always known, but on the kids who are in the school that receives an entirely new group of students, and that is a tremendous challenge. You know, we would manage that challenge, but it's not something to do lightly. So I think that the short answer is that we would, seek to balance out that capacity. Back to the exchange I was having with Dr. Garcia a moment ago. Last year, one of the things that we learned and that we listened to, but that we learned, was that some of our projections for how many families in a school that was going to move, not close, and the number of spaces in the building that it was going to go into, here I'm thinking of Lincoln and Riverside, were very different when we heard from families about what some of their priorities might be from when we just did the cold calculating math. It convinced me that there might have been no room at the inn if we had actually done that, because of the number of families that would have stayed and the number of families who would have continued and maybe chosen the new school. So there's the value of that broader public input that helped us actually say, in the end, these are decisions that our families make. We don't control what they do. So it's trying to estimate where people are going to be. So we would do that with as much accuracy as possible, but it would be hard to predict exactly what decisions families would make in that scenario. I don't know, John, if there's anything else that you'd add to that. We would balance it out as effectively as we could, but we also don't want and can't have kids taking hour and 15-minute bus rides in this district anymore because we couldn't have implemented the new start times this year that I think have generally been well received if we hadn't constrained our transportation routes. So whatever schools they would need to go to would need to be geographically sufficiently adjacent that we don't actually try and save money by closing a school but balloon our transportation funding to get kids further to the new school that they're going to go to.
I would just echo what was mentioned before, is that we're going to have to do the boundary planning process again. And while you may not hear your school closing, every school, every elementary school, the lines may change slightly to accommodate reshuffling, resorting.
Slightly or significantly.
Slightly or significantly.
I mean, it would depend. It would depend on, I mean, some schools might have a significant change even if the school is not closing because, you know, we have to serve and we're pleased to serve those families.
And when it comes to stakeholder input, I think what we've seen in past boundary changes, that's not really a conversation where we can take a lot of stakeholder input. I know people want us to, and they want us to look at various things, but how many times have we been through this in the past few years? And given the constraints of our transportation costs, we may not be able to draw those boundaries based on the fact that, you know, we have 100 parents coming to us saying, please keep our neighborhood going to this school. So that might be an area where stakeholder input, the data is going to show us where the boundaries need to be drawn if the schools are closed.
I think one other thing, when we fill a building to capacity, we can limit ourselves when we talk about rethinking our funding. A building like Franklin that uses some of their compensatory funding to create some smaller class sizes, do some unique class structures for kids, that becomes very limited when there's not space to do so anymore. So the more packed buildings become, or the more utilized the buildings become, the less opportunity there is to use the funding creatively.
Karen,
Okay.
she's right in my line of sight.
Sorry. And she's in her line of sight. And I guess what I'm hearing from this is maybe it's a messaging thing while we talk about the referendum. And I know messaging is important, but I would want to have this say, close 3 elementary schools, assume it's you and your school.
Assume it's you.
Or it's going to impact your school. And that maybe we need to be more clear about that. The second thing I was thinking about in terms of messaging is that I've been talking to people who have kids in the school and people who don't. I'm wondering if increasing class sizes by 3 might not be clear to people outside the district, or I mean, sorry, outside the schools. That maybe we do that as a percentage in some form rather than, you know, what, 10 to 15 or 10 to, I'm trying to do some math and that's not my forte. But, you know, a retired person might not know what the class size is. If it's 21 up to 24, they might not know that level of detail, but they might understand a broader percentage.
And that's sort of where I was kind of going with my point, except more to say in my artistic brain, like to paint that picture for them. So if we can't say, you know, we are choosing these 3 elementary schools, for people, even if you do have children in the district, I don't think, you know, a parent who has a child at Franklin understands the size of like Lincoln necessarily, you know, or a class of the same grade at Lincoln. And so to be able to say, and maybe figuring out ways to use all of the schools as examples in some way, like what we mean when we say close 3 elementary schools, it would be like we're choosing this school, this school, this school. What would be the equivalent of closing half of Mayo, or taking away the football field at John Marshall or something like that. And because I think that those things help anchor people in the visual of like, oh, what is going away? And I think I used this example last time we were talking, you know, we have 2 former educators on the school board. And so it would, you know, it would be like, the thing we're talking about is taking away 3 of Director Workman's orchestra classes, or Dr. Marvin's AP English class. And so for people who are in those classes, they can say, oh no, that is me, even if we're not identifying those are the specific classes that are getting taken away. Or for someone to understand, like, what do we mean by a non-instructional position? If you say, you know, Natalia Benjamin's position would be an example. Everybody that knows her would be like, are you kidding me? No way, we would never want that to happen. And then I think it gives a little bit more, not just agency, but like personalization to the people who are listening to the message. I agree absolutely that it has to do with the messaging, because people, unless maybe you have a trauma history, which that's a whole other bucket of things, but most people are gonna assume it's not me. And then when it is them, they're gonna feel betrayed by the district. Even though we're telling them and have been telling them basically since before the last referendum, it could be you. And here is what we're doing. It still didn't land the way that I think we were hoping it would. And I think even in this instance where we're doing like take two of what happened last year, people are still not gonna think it's gonna be me. Unless we give them something to truly visualize and understand. And I think even having conversations about those bus routes, like if we close these 3 schools, these are all of the other schools that are gonna be affected in terms of bus routes, even if we're broad strokes explaining that. I think that that's helpful, and that, you know, we could broad strokes examples, but with what we already know, offering specificity. So if we always are gonna know it's 16.7 at a minimum, what does that mean and what does that look like? And I think if people understood, like, it would mean closing all operations and staff positions at all 3 of our high schools. That's what we're talking about when we say $16.7 million. That rings very differently in a parent's brain, and also in a non-parent in the district's brain, because then they'll be like, oh, I live next to that school. That would be weird to just not have that there or available, because my NA group meets there, or my church meets there, or this is where we do XYZ community event. That wouldn't be there anymore. Thank you.
Sure, Nathan.
Yes, Director Roth.
I had the opportunity this past Monday to attend the regional Minnesota State High School League meeting here held in Rochester. And part of the mission statement was to reiterate that sports and performing arts are indeed a part of the educational process. And that I think as a board, we need to be careful to not necessarily pit one area against another area. For instance, in terms of student numbers, we have a relatively small number of students that are involved or engaged in advanced learning services. Just as an example. And yet we would agree that is an important area, and that's part of our Ignite Student Learning, where we want more students to take full advantage of that. And I know you've not asked us to, during this study session or potential board discussions, to make the decision as to what and where. You are saying, well, that's what you hired me to do, and I believe you're fully capable of doing that. And I appreciate the guidance you provide. I do think it is important, though, that we also don't want to suggest to our stakeholders that their input is not valued or of value, and to suggest that we've made decisions regardless of what they're going to say. Because these are the same people that we are hoping will see who have heard us and who are able to see the benefit of passing this referendum. And for us to, in advance of that, suggest that it doesn't really matter what you say, we're going to this. I appreciate the reality. Okay, I'm a realist, and you know, and so I think in some respects we're premature, and we as a board may be premature in really, you know, suggesting to you, well, we don't want this or we don't want that. All you've asked of us, I believe, if I heard correctly and can read clearly, do we want you to proceed in offering a recommendation for consideration at our next board meeting, and the one after that to, if we say yes, then you're going to go ahead and work the magic, provide the information. The board will have opportunity to say yes or no, or suggest, well, what about this area, that area, as we do with our annual budget processes anyway. And so I don't think we have to, at this point, juncture in time, think that the process is changing because of the seriousness of what it is we're talking about. And so I, having 6 children and 20 grandkids, I've learned how to be patient and wait for the process to manifest itself. And so I will anxiously wait to see what you present.
You know, we are asking our stakeholders for input. And their input is by November 5th. This is the time for them to really say, do we want the district to not make 16.7 minimum in cuts, yes or no? And then that information will tell us what we need to do next. So I think very much at this point, yes, putting a referendum out there is asking the stakeholders what they want us to do. This is their chance. I hope they see the necessity for all that we've presented here.
I think I can also just briefly say, as I said at the outset, it is highly likely that significantly more than $16.7 billion would need to be cut. I'm highlighting that because we're certain of that. Other efficiencies, other changes in state policy, one-time use of the reserves might factor, but not to the point where we could avoid at least that core cut. So things like arts and athletics might potentially be in what else would be reduced beyond what's here, but we'll take that idea for sure into consideration and bringing you something to discuss.
Do we have an option to consider expanding the walk boundaries for transportation?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's one of the other options.
Dr. Cook?
I was just about to say that exact same thing, because if you add up all of our transportation costs, it is nearly $18 million. And of course, I appreciate that we're obligated under state law, and probably for good reason, to provide transportation to our students. But yeah, I think that really ought to be part of the decision space. I don't think standing alone, it's a great idea to have a transportation boundary that goes all the way to 2 miles down to kindergarten age students. But as between that and, you know, 4th grade classrooms with 34 or 33 students in them, no, I guess it'd be 35, wouldn't it?
34.
Anyway, too many. You know, I just think that is the level that we're at, where those are the types of trade-offs that we need to be able to consider as a board. And the other thing I just wanted to share about the elementary school closures. I think the process that you've outlined, Superintendent, makes a lot of sense, and the opportunity for community engagement, stakeholder engagement to refine an ultimate recommendation makes a lot of sense. But I do feel like it's important that as an individual board member, I'm as transparent in my thinking on this at this stage as I can be, and certainly feel free to continue to evolve my thinking as additional information comes forward. But the way I see the numbers, it's excess capacity of about 1,100 students at the elementary level. So that's roughly what we'd be looking at, the capacity of school buildings to close. The other thing that's on my mind is the boundary adjustments. That weighs heavily because that is the disruption that we're talking about. And so one of the things that I think of immediately is that we have 3 elementary schools that don't have attendance boundaries, the district-wide option schools. And so to the extent that closing those minimize disruption in attendance boundaries. Otherwise, I think that would be something that should be strongly considered in the best interests of all the students. Beyond that, I would just reiterate what everybody's already said, that none of this seems like it's a good idea on its own. But just wanted to share, that's where my thinking would be at on that point right now, to be transparent about it.
And I think, just to clarify for anybody watching, our transportation block boundaries are not at 2 miles, which is what the state maximum is. So we are providing busing to students that the state does not require us to provide busing to.
Yes. I think maybe just, I don't know, Madam Chair, if you feel like we're kind of getting to a transition point. I feel this has been exactly the kind of feedback I was hoping for. I will say that, well, I'm going to present you with a resolution, and I know you'll take it seriously and look at it. Should you decide, for some of the reasons that have been talked about tonight, not to approve that resolution because there is a need for greater analysis and time, I would not see that as some kind of a rejection of a formal budget proposal. It is a desire to respond to our community and give them a sense. To Chair Nathan's point a moment ago, though, were anyone to conclude that that is because there's a rabbit that can be pulled out of a hat or a white knight coming over the mountain, that would be very ill-advised. So we will prepare a resolution along these lines and incorporate some of these themes. And of course, you'll receive it first in prep for action, where you are not asked to take action, and then you'll have a chance to take action on it. And should you, as some of the comments tonight suggest, ultimately decide to do that, in October before we've done a lot is challenging. I would understand that. I also think it would be responsive to what we've heard from our stakeholders for this board to be on record. And so I think there's merit in both approaches, but I feel that I've heard enough direction from you to bring you a resolution that reflects as much of this feedback as we can master, and then we'll have an opportunity to look at that at the next board meeting, and then you'll have an opportunity to vote on it at the follow-up.
Board members, anything else before we move on? Thank you. Our next agenda item is 4.1. This is a prep for action item. Resolutions for MSBA Delegate Assembly, and I believe Director McLaughlin is going to kick us off.
So Director Workman and I are the two MSBA delegates for this December. And one of the things we've talked about on the legislative committee is, should we develop some sort of resolution to present at the MSBA Delegate Assembly in December? The legislative committee determined that that was something we wanted to pursue. So one of the things we did is we reached out to Dr. Pakel and staff, John and Peter Christensen, about, or Christopherson, I think it is, about what types of things would be helpful. And one of the responses was dealing with data requests that the district is receiving and how cumbersome they are becoming. So I think you all have the handout that we put together for the agenda tonight. And Director Workman and Director Garcia, please jump in if you have other comments as well. The first item is a recommendation that our legislative committee include a provision in our legislative platform for 2025, which I believe we would get to the board sometime December, January, to propose amendments and modifications for the Minnesota Data Practices Act. That idea came from correspondence with Dr. Pakel and some individuals in Hennepin County local government about the concept of taking that on as a project and partnering on that project in a much broader sense than just RPS or school districts in general, but local government and how to modernize the Minnesota Data Practices Act. And I do think that's something that the legislative committee should consider and that we will likely recommend to the board when we present our platform. The second item, and definitely jump in if you have questions, or if we can take questions about either one of these separately. The second recommendation is the legislative committee recommending a proposed resolution to consider at the MSBA Delegate Assembly. And I make the point here that we would be joining efforts with the Hastings School District and Farmington School District to offer a joint resolution because they've worked on this topic as well. The people who reached out to me were Kyle Christensen from Farmington and Jessica Dressley and Mark Zuzek of Hastings to join their resolution about prohibiting anonymous data requests. And then secondly, offering our own resolution to permit school districts and other local government units to charge a reasonable fee when requests are clearly lead to commercial uses. And I would ask Mr. Carlson, you kind of came up with that concept and put that in my mind if you want to speak to that further, because sort of generated the origins with you and how that impacts the district and, you know, kind of how broad that topic and that concern is. But unless Dr. Garcia or Director Workman have anything to add, I think you all read the resolutions and if you have any questions.
Just a comment. So for our viewing public, MSBA Delegate Assembly, can you perhaps delve into that? These aren't individual actions. We're lobbying the legislature to do as the Rochester Public School Board in conjunction with other school boards, that they're actually, if you could then pick it up from there.
Sure, and MSBA is the Minnesota School Board Association. Director Workman, do you maybe want to talk about that since
Sure.
you've been involved more than
Yeah.
I've only been a delegate one
Sure.
term and she's been longer.
So the Minnesota School Board Association has carved up the state into a lot of different areas. So our area includes not only Rochester, but a few of the surrounding schools as well. And so in December, before December happens, we get from MSBA the resolutions that have been presented to the board, the MSBA board, to consider at our assembly as to whether we want to advance these or not, and then we vote on them. Along with that, MSBA also provides their take on what the resolution is as to whether they would recommend it, have no opinion on it, or not recommend it, and all the supporting reasons for each of those choices. So we come together, we vote. Last one was your first one, and it was really quite lively discussion about a number of issues that came up. You know, because oftentimes it's like, well, we know how everybody's going to vote. You know, it's like 110 votes yes and 2 votes no, or the other way around. But some of the resolutions, the vote was a lot closer than I had anticipated that it would be. And it also gives us a time to hear what other districts are experiencing. And I think with the Data Privacy Act and what we are allowed to charge or not charge is statewide. And Karen touched on, Hennepin County has been in touch with us about this, and I'm sure there are other government agencies that have the same concern with this general issue. So then of all the resolutions that we vote on, and there are usually, anywhere between 20 and 25, then MSBA will narrow those down, and they lobby on those. So that's how we have input. I mean, from starting with our board and then to the delegate assembly level and then to the legislature.
And I would add to that a little bit to clarify, what we vote on at the delegate assembly becomes then part of the MSBA platform that they use to lobby our legislators at the state level. The other thing that I learned through the process this year is that once a resolution passes the delegate assembly on any given year, that remains active and something they use moving forward. So when I started digging into this topic, I learned that and that's one of the reasons that I liked what Hastings and Farmington has already done, is that they reference some existing resolutions from earlier years. One was from 2017 and one was from 2021, that those maintain as existing resolutions and can be incorporated into what the lobbying efforts are. The other thing that I think they may have changed that just this year or last year is that any resolution presented, and that's why we're here tonight, is any resolution presented to the MSBA Delegate Assembly needs to be approved by the school board. Random school board members are no longer permitted to present something without their entire school board approval, which I think is a good way to make sure that there's some consensus from various districts before presenting something that might not have a lot of impact across the state.
One of the other things I'd like to add is one of the resolutions that comes up every single year is full funding of special education. And it's not like, well, we're going to present this one year, well, the legislature didn't do it, so we'll drop it. So I don't know how many years we've been lobbying for full funding of special education. And it wasn't until this last session that we actually got some relief from that. So on the proposal that we have here, I would not necessarily anticipate that it's going to be solved by the legislature, but, you know, after they hear about it from year to year to year to year, then eventually, hopefully, something will get done. Hopefully, it won't take years.
Dr. Martin?
Thank you. I think both of these recommendations, resolutions, make perfect sense. This district and many districts understand that when someone makes a data request, it can take hundreds of hours of staff time to provide that kind of data. And what this thing is, one of these is talking about, is that it will not be proper any longer for the data request to be made anonymously. It could have been coming from someone who doesn't even live in the country. I think that makes perfect sense. So that the entity who is requesting the data, the district will know who that is in the event that there is going to be some sort of reimbursement. The other part is that districts can ask for or require a reasonable charge for the person asking for the data. And my question is, who determines what's reasonable? Because I mean, I think if you want the data, and if it's going to take a district 1,000 hours to give you everything you want, we've seen those before, you should be charged something, but what's reasonable?
And I would answer in first two different things. My understanding in doing this research is that some states permit anonymous and some don't.
Okay.
So that's one piece of things. Mr. Carlson, do you want to speak to the other piece about how you determine reasonable already? I mean, it seems like that's part of your role.
Yeah, we look at it kind of through the lens of you have to read it and understand it first, and then you have to apply some judgment as to what kind of time you're going to put into it, where are you going to go searching. Honestly, if you're searching through emails, that's faster than having to go through paper files. But searching through emails also comes with the responsibility of redacting any not public information. And so then there's still human element and time involved in reading and figuring that out. So yeah, if we get one that's very, very extensive, that's going to take a lot of work, we try to give a best estimate up front so that we know what it's going to take and what it might cost.
So I have a quick question for you on that. So the time that you take to let the inquirer know how much it's going to cost them, they may say, oh, that's too much, I'm not going to do it. Are you reimbursed at all for the time that you've put in just to get to that point?
No, we have not been, and nor I don't, because we haven't produced anything, so I don't think you could bill for anything at that point.
And my understanding from the research too is that redaction is a lot of times the very labor intensive, depending on what it can be. That's part of the challenge.
That's correct.
One of the other things I did learn from the resolution is that some of the districts are encountering situations where they go through that whole process, and then because it's anonymous, people don't even show up to look at the data, and that's a complete waste of time and money. I think that's what's driving some of the discussions here.
It was one of the examples that Hastings incurred a $6,000 legal fee for a request from a requester who didn't show up. And that's
That's real money.
yeah.
It's almost
real
like a
money.
fully funded student for a year that it costs.
Right, yeah, especially, and when we're talking about, proposed budget cuts, I feel like that would be like a bottom priority thing for me, and easy to cut. Do you know, could you estimate how much we're spending on these sorts of requests already?
I think we'd probably want to do a little talking and analysis on that because we have a position now that's not fully devoted to it, but a chunk of the time is devoted to it. So I would make some sort of reasonable estimate based on how much time he's spending.
So like 50% of some person's time in the district is spent managing these requests. That's how often they're coming in. Or how extensive they are.
I would want to talk to make sure I understand about how much time it is. I wouldn't say it's exactly 50%. It could be more, it could be less, but there's a portion of a position.
And that doesn't include legal fees for any of the examinations for redactions or things
Yep,
like that.
there are some that we consult with and generate some legal costs like that too to figure out what to do and how to respond and all that.
So as MSBA is requiring us to pass a resolution, which is what would be on the agenda at the next meeting for action, the language that would be in the resolution that we would be approving is the proposed resolution number 1, be it resolved MSBA, and then also the proposed resolution number 2, be it resolved MSBA, those 2 paragraphs.
I believe that they would want us to include the whole content, the description of the problem, the explanation why this is a problem. So just a larger resolution with all it, unless we can put that in our background, would maybe be another option.
I think that's the required information that they ask you in the form. But in terms of what we vote on, we're supposed to approve just the be it resolved.
language. Okay. Then that makes sense. Yes.
Could you repeat that?
So MSBA has the form where you have to submit the resolution, and then you're also supposed to submit describe the problem and explain why this is the problem section. I think all we have to vote on in our
It's
formal
what,
resolution
yeah.
is just the be it
It's-
resolved pieces.
It's what MSBA is requiring on the form, correct.
So does anybody have any comments or language changes to talk about with regard to those 2 paragraphs titled "Be It Resolved," so that when we write the resolution for next week, we have the right language?
Chair Nathan, before we do that, Mr. Carlson, can you speak concise, because you can do this more concise. I just get mad about this topic, but I don't talk about it very well, about the commercial use of our.
Yeah, so there's a vendor, I think we just got it again in the last couple days, that regularly requests all purchase orders that we've generated in the district. So basically where have we spent our money, and what I believe they are doing with is they're data mining the results of it. They're putting in a database to sell to others, like, hey, this school district bought this for this price, but this one got it at this price. And so they're making a financial gain off just information they're getting for relatively no cost or free, basically, from us.
In the way you
There's
explained it
multiple,
to
not just one. People are monetizing this all over, and it's gonna explode. And people are actually now becoming businesses to help people craft data requests to monetize it. So I am, and
It's like a
I
second
am-
level.
Absolutely, I am so enthused that this board is taking this on. Right now, it's a unproductive drain on our resources, though we're privileged and pleased to provide authentic insight to the public that wants data requests. But it risks being a runaway train. And I just have to acknowledge the person that Dr. Garcia was just asking about is back there, Peter Christofferson, who is a wonderful teacher in our district and whose primary work is helping our schools use FastBridge and other data, but who has been invaluable in actually systematizing how we respond to these. So thank you, Peter, but I would rather have you helping teachers with FastBridge data than fulfilling records requests for Smart Procure so they can sell it somewhere. So I think this board has developed very common sense approaches that do not undermine the true purpose of data requests, but could help this district and others get ahead of what I really do believe could be a runaway train.
At the very least, the legislature needs to modernize the language. It's like, you may charge 10 cents per page or 25 cents per page. You know, paper. We don't do paper anymore, so we can't charge them for that because we don't have it on paper. Or maybe if we do, then we would, but.
But that doesn't mean the costs of complying with the requests have gone down, because so much of it is digitized or in some sort of data format. You still have to go through the process of obtaining it and organizing it, redacting it, et cetera.
Quick question. It's my understanding that when people do give a data request, that they don't have to give a reason why. Is
No.
that true?
That's
They don't.
correct.
So they just say, I want all this data on these specific things. I don't need to tell you who I am.
That's right.
And I'm not going to tell you why I want it. So that's a bad thing.
And I don't want to pay for it either.
And what John just said, yeah.
And Mr. Carlson, I just want to add into what you were describing. The way I understood it from our earlier discussions is that it's not just, they're not just seeking the data from Rochester, it's all districts, and that's what they're combining and making, it's their business model, as you described it, to do this. That's what they do for a business, is collect this data on various things and sell it.
Nationwide.
Nationwide. So that's why we need, I just feel like we need to tap into those funds if we're talking about how we're going to pay for things like this and other things.
Well,
Director Barr.
I just want to thank our legislative committee for the work they've done, and I look forward to voting on this recommendation at our next board meeting.
I would like to really personally thank Director McLaughlin, because she has done the really very heavy lifting in terms of all of the contents and the contacts and the putting this document together. It's been hours and hours of her time, and I, for one, very much appreciate it, as I'm sure the rest of the board does as well.
I will second that.
Superintendent, your observation on the data mining potential of government data seems spot on to me. I can very easily imagine how to build a business model around that activity. I don't know that this resolution will be real effective, but maybe it's a good first step. You know, you got to start somewhere, like you were saying, Director Workman. But yeah, that's a tricky one. Aside from classifying new sets of data as private or something, it would not be trivial to stop that. The only other thing I wanted to share, and Director Workman, I'm so glad that you started by talking about how it's been many years that addressing the special education cross-subsidy has been one of the top items to come out of the MSBA Delegate Assembly, because I really think that is the thing that hopefully all school districts in Minnesota are pushing the legislature to address. And
They are.
instead of going from 6.4 to 44% of the special education cross-subsidy, to just go ahead and fund special education, make it 100%. Why not? So I do think that is the very best thing that the legislature could do for school districts statewide. But yeah, this looks like a good set of resolutions. Thanks for preparing it.
And do I also hear that as a plug to the legislative committee for perhaps including that as part of our legislative agenda for next year regarding the special education cross-subsidy?
Yes, and I think that was discussed the last time we looked at the legislative priorities. But yes, that is, you can consider that a plug, yes.
Okay, and I have a note. Anything else, board members? So we will incorporate these two paragraphs as is in a resolution for our next regular meeting. So some housekeeping items. Our annual board calendar draft update is in the agenda. Are there any items a board member would like to bring forward for consideration on the future agenda? Hearing none. Upcoming board meeting dates, September 24th at 5:30 is a regular meeting. October 8th at 5:30 is a regular meeting. October 15th at 5:30 is a study session. And on October 22nd at 5:30, we have a special session on field trip fees. And immediately following the special session is a regular meeting. And hearing no other business, this meeting is adjourned at 7:10 PM.